Good day everyone, and welcome to this fifth lecture, which will focus on the Civil War and the Republic. Basically, this means that we're starting a new episode of Don't Lose Your Heads. Now, let's focus on what the situation is at the beginning of this lecture and at the end of lecture 5. Got a situation of civil war, neighbour versus neighbour, father versus son, with a conflict that was, in terms of proportion, deadlier than World War I. And that led to, what did it lead to? I bet she's going to say the beheading. And no, it led to the execution of my dear self, Charles I, and the abolition of the monarchy in 1649, something that would have been completely unthinkable in 1642. Now, historians have been fighting over the meaning of those events. Indeed, some have argued that the Civil War was a conflict of the elites with the gentry opposing the king, a conflict of privilege against prerogative, to quote David Hume, revealing deep structural fault of the Stuart states. But that being said, it's also been argued that it was actually a wider social conflict involving popular elements with radical aspects as well. Now we're quoting Christopher Hill, we've mentioned him before, and the idea of the English Revolution, or even revolutions with an S. But it's also been said that the Civil War was a series of accidents that were quickly resolved. Accidents meaning problems with the personality of the king, see what the problem could be, but that those accidents were quickly resolved with the restoration of the monarchy and the status quo being restored in 1666. In other words, the interpretation of the events that are going to follow, or the interpretation is not 100% clear and settled. On the menu, we'll first discuss the Civil War itself, and we'll talk about the growth of Parliament's power, religious fragmentation, and how it led eventually ended with Parliament's victory. Then we'll wonder whether these events constitute a revolution. We'll talk about the new model army, Oliver Cromwell and radicalism, the Parliament fighting its own army in a sense, within itself dissensions. We'll wonder if the king was a man of blood, and we'll see how the army seized control of Parliament. This will lead us to discuss the Republic and the Protectorate, with challenges coming from outside England, clashes between Cromwell and his Commonwealth and the Protectorate. Let us begin with the first Civil War. And a series of images. In 1640, Charles I was forced, by lack of money, to call his parliament. That's the picture you first saw appear on the screen. If we go back towards it before the battle. Now remember that he hadn't called a parliament for a bloody long time. Then in 1641, Charles tried to oppose Parliament's constitutional reforms that reduced his power. That's also something that was discussed in the previous lecture with the Grand Remonstrance. In 1642, Charles I raised an army against the Great Rebellion, and this marked the beginning of the war opposing the Cavaliers, those who were fighting for Charles on Charles's side, and the Roundheads that were fighting for Parliament. I'll let you look up why they were called the Roundheads, but you can make some wild guesses before you do that. So let's first focus on the growth of the Parliament's power. In the 1642 military campaign, Parliament managed to secure control of London. And Parliament was favoured by its bourgeois, urban, middling sort of tradesmen, craftsmen. This forced Charles, because London had been secured by Parliament, this forced Charles to establish his base in Oxford. And the war started to spread to all areas. It was not simply a series of battles between the two armies, but also skirmishes and guerrilla warfare and clashes between local troops. Paradoxically, though, war led Parliament to develop powers which had caused rebellion against the king, with high taxation collected directly by Parliament, and centralized rule, which is exactly what the issue was with the king's abuse of power. And with an efficient bureaucracy and administration, again, something that had been reproached, that the king had been reproached with. What we witness as well is religious fragmentation, with strong Puritan faction in parliaments justifying armed resistance to the king as a religious case of conscience. Like, we have to defy the king, we have to rebel against the king because it is our duty, with a belief that it was better to obey God than a king who does not defend true religion. War became a duty in a sense to those guys. War was seen as a godly war, a war that was fought in the name of God. They secured the abolition of the Anglican Church in favor of more Protestantism, more Calvinism. But the Puritans did not agree over what to replace it with, hence the question of religious fragmentation to be read at different levels. Indeed, a national Calvinist church, such as the one that existed in Scotland, could have been one option according to some. Separate individual Calvinist churches, as in New England, another option. Huge differences basically prevailed over doctrine and theology. There was also the development of radical religious groups that were called sects, this radical religious group, and fragmentations all over the shop. But one question we could ask ourselves is whether fragmentation is actually inherent within Protestantism itself. At the end of the church meant the end of censorship. So there was an absolute explosion of pamphlets, news sheets, and tracts, as they were called. An annual average of 500 in the 1630s versus 30,000 from 1640 to 1660. So you see how it really explodes, and if you have skills in terms of maths, you can calculate the percentage of, in terms of increase. I do not, as the king. I have people calculate for me. But basically you have many tracts, and many of them were promoting religious, social change in a very radical way, political change in a radical way, and economic change in a radical way as well. So what we see is the fragmentation of religious life and the spread of heretical public opinion being described by conservatives as a dangerous gangrene, like a sickness, like something that has to be cut off. Like, if it has gangrene, if it's been affected by a disease, what it means is that it needs to be severed, it needs to be cut off, which is an interesting keyword for today's lesson. Now, in 1643-44, the king was at an advantage in spite of the English Parliament's alliance with Protestant Scotland that made it a bit stronger. But in 1645, Parliament decided to restructure its army, leading to the so-called New Model Army, with Oliver Cromwell, pictured on the right of the slides, as one of its leading generals. Of course, Cromwell will come back quite prominently. A member of the poor gentry and a staunch Puritan, Oliver Cromwell grew confident that his military victories were making him God's instruments, that he'd been chosen by him, with a capital H, to fight for a moral reform of society. This was basically England's first professional army with proper training, with salaries, wages, regular pay, so to speak, and the promotion of soldiers based on merit. There was also discipline that was enforced, so maximum efficiency for this new model army. This doesn't mean that there weren't several deaths, of course, quite more than several, with the most unpleasant ways to die during the Civil War being listed by the Earl of Manchester's .co.uk. So one of the worst ways to die would have been to be speared by a pike, which was a long wooden spear that was extremely long, 18 feet. But being shot by a musket ball would have been quite unpleasant as well, because they were notoriously inaccurate, which meant that you could be basically you could be finding yourself being shredded to pieces. That would have been tearing through your body, even though perhaps the aim had not been reached. Could be clubbed to death with a musket. So another horrible way to die, with a musket. Mown down by cavalry, being hit by a cannonball, disease as well, meaning you could die before the fighting began, or you could die right after the fighting had begun. Being blown up, getting an infection with nasty stuff like blood poisoning, gangrene again, but this time in a very literal way, and without antibiotics and painkillers. This would have been quite a nasty way to go. But I think the worst way in which you could die during the Civil War was being clubbed to death with your own wooden leg, which is what happens to a professional Catholic soldier who'd lost a leg after he'd fallen from his horse and was basically beaten to death with his own wooden leg. Now, coming back to Charles, he was defeated by Cromwell's army in 1646 and he was made prisoner. He was forced to negotiate peace with his enemies, that is to say the Parliament, of course, but those enemies were divided themselves and didn't quite know what to do with dear old Charles. This leads us to the question of revolution. The new model army itself became a hotbed for political radicalism. In other words, there were many radicals within the army itself, but not all of them were radicals, hence those questions of fragmentation. The professional discipline of fighting for a common cause really gave soldiers of humble origins a sense of self-worth and a political consciousness that they didn't necessarily have before. They believed that they fought for their own rights against the king's tyranny and privileges, as much as for the defense of Parliament. And many soldiers had been recruited by Cromwell among the radical Puritan sects. Those guys would have seen themselves as an army of saints dedicated to God's cause. Remember the notion of the godly war. So they were meant to deliver England from sin and oppression. They believed that they would deliver England from sin and oppression, so they saw their mission as sacred. The most radical ones formed, along with other sects in London, something called the Levellers, a group called the Levellers. Now, levelling was a term of abuse. It meant putting the rich and the poor on the same level, which, of course, would have been seen as extremely bad, because it's erasing those differences, those hierarchical differences. They were highly organized groups with meetings, demonstrations, pamphlets, and petitions as well. And they demanded social justice, economic freedom, and political rights. For example, No more established church, religious toleration of all Protestants, trial by jury, not by judge, a jury of your peers, habeas corpus, no death penalty for diverging opinion, no conscription, a parliamentary election every year, or at least every of a year, every 2 years, no more veto for the House of Lords, and all men over 21, according to the Levellers, should have the right to vote, with monopoly of trade granted by the king to some merchants that should cede so that there would be free trade, and the abolition of prison for debt. Basically, what they were suggesting was akin to a social revolution. But Parliament started to clash with its own army because the gentry and the aristocracy in Parliament did not want that social revolution that would give all men the right to vote. This would have been an attack on their privileges that would have been far worse than the tyranny of the king itself. And in both cases, their property was threatened. So, what do when you're being bothered? You jail the levelers, you jail the leaders of the level leaders, such as John Lilburne, that can be seen on the slide at the very top of the slide, who attacked the House of Lords during his own trials. A majority of people in Parliament opted for a quick settlement with Charles on the basis of the constitutional reforms of 1640-41. If you're unsure of what those are, you can feel free to go back to the previous lecture. But no more than that. So a very tense situation, basically. Cromwell and the army leaders wanted more assurances against royal power. They wanted more than the constitutional reforms from 1640-41. And they wanted a stronger religious reform. So the army took control of London in August 1647 to put pressure on Parliament. But at the Putney debates of October 1647, army leaders rejected the most radical aspects of the Levellers' agreement of the people. That was their draft proposal that they had for a new written constitution of England. That's what they were suggesting. That was seen as extremely radical, and as such, army leaders rejected that because they also saw themselves as threatened by the Levellers' social revolution, so to speak. Now it's interesting to note that Occupy London has recently, of course, the recent movement has hosted two new Putney debates in 2012 and 2014. If you're curious, you can check out their page. These events have been inspired by the Levellers and by the diggers' demands for social justice and civil rights. So that's interesting that this is something that is still feeding, that is still seen as symbolic and of interest nowadays. Now, what about the king? What about the king in this situation? The king took advantage of the divisions and escaped in 1647. He struck a deal with Scotland and launched a second war on the English Parliament in 1648. So the army declared him a man of blood, an enemy of the people, and vowed to remove him at all costs. So in the summer of 1648, the king's army was defeated a second time. The army seizes control of Parliament, and in order to purge the House of Commons from the members that were ready to settle with the king, to come up with an agreement with the king, the members that were hostile to his being removed altogether were removed themselves from Parliament. So more than half of the members of Parliament at the time were ejected. As you can see in the top right of today's slides, this current slide, which is what is called the Rump Parliament, because of the meaning of the word rump, which I shall not illustrate. In January 1649, the king was tried for treason, and the king was found guilty. There was a key role that was played by Cromwell within the jury to convince others to sign the death warrant that signaled the coming death of the king. And this led to an unprecedented event in Europe. Charles I was publicly executed in the name of the English people. This was traumatic for other European monarchies and for many English subjects who believed regicide was basically killing God itself, killing God himself. Paradoxically, Charles gained a popularity after death that he never had actually enjoyed during his lifetime. And thanks to Eikon Basilike, which is the title of this book that was published posthumously after he died, supposedly written by him right before his death, there was a mystique of divine right monarchy that was reinforced. Was Charles a bad king? Was he a martyr? Was he a murderer? I recommend that you watch Charles I, Martyr and Murderer, was Charles a Bad King on YouTube. It's 5 minutes of your time, and I think you will enjoy it and find it interesting. But Charles came to the throne just after the last generation of Elizabethan artists had passed away, with Shakespeare having died in 1660, just so that you can connect the literature lessons with the history lessons. Numerous poets, writers, playwrights that had been famous at the end of Elizabeth's reign and during James's reign had all died by then. So it thus happened that the climax of Charles's power coincided with the coming of age of a new generation of artists. And himself, Charles, was an art lover with lots of money spent on entertainments, something that had been quite controversial, and a fashion of court masks that had given birth to spectacular but very expensive shows with music and dancing, and the court reached a very high degree of sophistication. Now, compared to his father's court, James I, which had been soiled by repeated sex scandals, Charles managed to create a life of, so we could call them, enlightened pleasures in Whitehall. But in March 1649, the monarchy and the House of Lords were abolished. England was declared a republic, the Commonwealth, with the members of the Parliament, the Rump Parliament, the one that had been purged, and a Council of State with no official presiding leader. Again, the Levellers tried to have their reforms accepted and a constitution written, but again, they were arrested. The army regiment supporting them through mutiny was suppressed by Cromwell, and that was the end of the Levellers movement, an event remembered every year by some left-wing activists in England, as you can see in the Levellers Day poster. This raises the question of whether this was a political rather than social revolution, a military coup by militant Puritans. In order to justify this radical act, because English kings had been killed before, but none had been executed in the name of the people and for the welfare of the people, those were the apologists of the regicide, such as John Milton, who was opposed to the theory of the divine right of kings, advanced the notion of a political contract between the king and people, which could be revoked at any given time, especially if the king had proved to do wrong. By acting as a tyrant in the past and by launching not one but two wars on his own people, the king had become a so-called man of blood, spilling the blood of innocent people, and he had himself broken the political contract so that the people were free to do without him. This argument sought to prove that the king was not above the rule of law. This leads us to today's last point, the Republic and the Protectorate. Now, even though the king had lost his head, there were still challenges that came from outside England. Indeed, Ireland, that was in the hands of Catholic rebels since 1641, as well as Protestant Scotland, refused to recognise the authority of the English Republic and declared Charles' son, king, as Charles II. Cromwell and his army decided to launch a punitive campaign on Ireland in 1649, with battles, with massacres, deportations. Between 1/4 and 1/3 of the population died between 1641 and 1653. Now, more transfer of land was also organised from Catholic to Protestants in the wake of the Ulster Plantation that had started earlier on, with Catholics that held about 60% of the land in 1641, but only 9% in 1660. Cromwell fought a successful Third Civil War against Charles II in Scotland in 1650-51, so we've got the Irish dimension to take into account, and the Scottish dimension as well, that is often forgotten, or has often been forgotten in the past by historians. The political unification of England, Ireland and Scotland under the 1654 Ordinance of Union. You can see here to the side Cromwell's flag, was paradoxical, because this type of centralization had been one of the causes that had led to the war against Charles I. So the reason why, one of the reasons why was centralization, and now it was being replaced by a system that was not that dissimilar to it. Second paradox was the constant threat of a counter-revolution, meaning that the permanence of a standing army was seen as necessary by some, but denounced as tyranny under the reign of Charles I, led to equal popular hatred for the Republic's military rules. So similarly, we see that paradox of a situation that was denounced, that was replaced by a situation that is not too dissimilar to it. What you've just seen right here in the current slides as the Commonwealth ruling with a standing army, as it's called, is the frontispiece to a document entitled Arbitrary Government Displayed, Warning of the Dangers of a Return to Republicanism. What it means is that the Commonwealth was represented as a dragon, with Parliament sitting in the belly of the beast, with its neck having representations of armed troops, and the tail, ironically, Latin liberties, being a chain encircling the people. So that's the warning of the dangers of a return to republicanism that was done later on. And it gives us an idea of how it was seen a little bit later on. This is 1683. So we're talking about a period when the monarchy had been restored in 1660. Now, England gained a standing in Europe that had not been seen before Tudor times, with propaganda to justify regime change at home and abroad. The Republic employed poet and pamphleteer John Milton, you may have heard of him in the literature lessons, who defended English liberty. The authority of the English Republic was unchallenged after successful wars that were waged against Scotland, with Holland and Spain, an alliance with France. France that was facing its own civil war, La France, if you remember your history lessons. In exile, Charles II failed to secure an international alliance that could help him reconquer the throne. And England rivaled its own neighbours in the conquest of the Atlantic world with the capture of Jamaica in 1655. So you can see that on today's map. There was a clash, however, between Cromwell and the Commonwealth, because Cromwell and Puritan zealots had an agenda of moral reform, of religious reform, of administrative reform. The administration of the Republic used a professional bureaucracy, but it was slowed down by faction and private interest of some members of parliament who wished to enhance their own power by keeping their seats indefinitely. And by seizing the lands of defeated royalists. In 1653, a new military coup occurs, with Cromwell dissolving Parliament and putting an end to the Commonwealth. This is the beginning of Cromwell's Protectorate. The only constitution in British history was written during Cromwell's Protectorate. It was called the Instrument of Government, and it was produced in 1653. It gave England a strong executive power, again with the Lord Protector, who was assisted by a small Council of State, but who had to govern with annual sessions of Parliament. So there was a sort of pragmatic balance between authority and freedom, and a sort of Republican president for life. But soon, Protector Cromwell became almost similar to a monarch. So what you can see on the current slide is Charles I to the left and Cromwell to the right. And you can see how stunning and how blindingly obvious those similarities are. Yeah, I know, it's pretty shocking and pretty striking. All frustration and tensions with the parliamentary class reappeared, with Cromwell giving the major generals of his army the power to reform the country at a local level. So they took over the running of the militias to quash potential counter-revolution. They introduced new taxes. There was a so-called godly reformation of manners, with a strict moral code that was to be enforced under Cromwell, with, for example, if you're wondering what does it mean, biblical education, or the monitoring of sports in ale houses, places that sold ale, which is a kind of beer. So this was amongst some deeply unpopular, and led people to wonder whether this was a sort of military dictatorship. But Cromwell himself was convinced that he was doing God's work, and that moral reform meant a fair social system and a fair criminal justice system. You can see the satire on Oliver Cromwell in the Protectorate, suggesting that he aimed to become king, with on the left the full-length figure of Cromwell wearing an armour, but also wearing a crown and an ermine cloak and holding the sword of justice. Behind what you see is the scene of the beheading of Charles I, and above that, a mock coat of arms with a dog wearing a mitra, that's the Pope's hat, and holding a sword, supported by two devils. There's also the whole question of Oliver Cromwell wishing you the kind of Christmas, well, the recently 2020 Christmas, is being seen as very Cromwell-like. Okay, what does this all mean? Well, to explain, Vindication of Christmas was a pamphlet that was published in 1652 against the Christmas ban. Christmas ban, you heard it. The woodcut on the front of this Vindication of Christmas shows an early image of Father Christmas. So you can pause on that slide if you want. You're probably thinking, what the hell? A ban on Christmas? Stricter laws were passed to catch anyone holding or attending a special Christmas church service. From 1656, legislation was passed to ensure that every Sunday was stringently observed as Holy Day, as the Lord's Day, and by contrast, shops and markets were told to stay open on December 25th. Soldiers were ordered to patrol the streets, to take any food that they discovered being prepared for Christmas celebrations, and some Puritans saw Christmas basically as a wasteful festival that threatened Christian beliefs and that really encouraged immoral activities. Now, Cromwell left people free to join the national church or to organise their own separate individual groups. You see freedom of worship given to all Protestants, but a ban on Catholicism and repression of radical enthusiasts who challenge the social order a little bit too much. So you can do what you want, but as long as it doesn't threaten the social order. The Quakers, for instance, were a group of people who rejected the authority of the Bible and had no respect for social hierarchy. You also had a group called the Renters that preached free love and disobedience to the laws. And the fifth monarchists believed that they had to prepare for the imminent return of Christ on earth by a government of the sect alone. Women often took a new, more prominent role in those movements. For example, Quaker women were allowed to preach, were allowed to speak. King, Republic, and Protectorate all attacked these groups. Whether it be before the Republic, during the Republic, and after the Republic with after the Commonwealth with the Protectorate, because they all threatened to turn the world upside down. So no matter who it was, what period, they were crushed. Some were crushed like the Diggers, who wanted to end private property. Private property was seen as thefts, and the Diggers promoted a strictly egalitarian society. Others, like the Quakers, survived, and they still exist to this day. Those developments were echoed in contemporaneous political theory, with Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, saw a society torn by civil war and religious divisions, but it was impossible to determine who holds the truth, as everyone says, I'm speaking God's truth, as everyone is the one claiming to be speaking God's truth. There was a necessity for a neutral state to arbitrate between competing interests for society to survive. Leviathan, the state, Cromwell's authority, that's a question that is, there's no clear answer to that. It's not clearly put, but the Leviathan's authority, the state's authority, should be absolute, whether it's to defend Cromwell's or it's more generic than that. No individual should stand above the law. So the rule of Leviathan is absolute because it is legitimate. It is chosen by the people in a social contract of the people, and they speak with one voice, which is why that figure is made up of lots and lots of people who end up being one figure, the Leviathan, the state, however it actually appears. But Oliver Cromwell died in 1658, which led to the return and the collapse again of the Republic, the return, the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, with Charles invited to take his crown by Cromwell's army generals, and basically the Republican experiment, years of military rule ending. Okay, let's just conclude on this. In 1660, Charles II was restored on the throne with no strings attached, no conditions. All laws since 1642 were abrogated. So was it all for nothing? The 1640s and 50s served as a model and a counter-model. The trauma of the war led to an enduring culture of political compromise. Rather than have all-out conflict, better to have a compromise. So the Protectorate was an early incarnation of the constitutional monarchy. Yes, it wasn't a monarchy, but some aspects of it meant that it is a form, an incarnation of that system that's coming up soon in the lectures. Reconciling king and parliament, liberty and authority, durably binding together property and liberty as one of the results of the trauma of the war. The centralization and administrative efficiency of the parliamentary state set a new modern standard as well. So another key word here. And the social revolution of radical groups failed. But the discussion of numerous innovative political ideas, new political ideas, from the Levellers to the Diggers to the Renters to Hobbes, gave birth to modern and often radical political ideologies. So to find out more, you can check out 1649 in Mioche, And well, what will we discuss on the next episode? If don't lose your heads, no actual spoilers, but we'll end with that final image. I'm wishing you the kind of day that Cromwell wouldn't wish if it was Christmas. You know what else? Let's just wish you a very happy, lovely, and pleasant day.
Someone has stepped on my cup.
I think it's you.